At my wedding, standing before 200 guests in a dress I'd saved 3 years to afford, my husband leaned into the microphone during his vows and said, "I'm embarrassed by you," and the entire room went so silent you could hear the flower petals hitting the marble floor. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, his groomsmen shifted their feet, and the priest actually took a step back from the altar as if the words themselves were contagious. I stood there in my grandmother's veil, feeling my face burn with a heat I'd never experienced before, my bouquet trembling in my hands while he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of that ornate church. "You don't belong here, not really, not with my family, not in this life I'm building, but I'm doing this anyway because I made a promise and I keep my word even when it costs me." And I watched my father start to rise from his seat in the front pew, his face purple with rage, but I held up one hand to stop him because something inside me had just snapped clean through like a frozen branch, and instead of crying or running or doing any of the things every person in that room expected me to do, I smiled, reached up, and removed the microphone from the stand between us. I looked out at his family seated on the right side of the church, his mother in her $15,000 dress she'd made sure to tell me the price of, his father who'd never once looked me in the eye during the entire 8 months of engagement, his sister who'd asked me at the rehearsal dinner if I understood I'd always be considered the help's daughter, no matter what ring I wore, and I saw them all sitting there with these satisfied smirks like they'd just watched their trained dog perform exactly the trick they'd been teaching him, and I turned back to my husband, this man I'd loved desperately for 3 years, this man who'd whispered different words in the darkness of our apartment, who'd told me I was everything, who'd said he'd fight his whole family if he had to, and I realized he'd been lying the entire time, not to them, but to me. The priest was making small gestures asking if we should continue, and I held up one finger to him in a wait motion that made several guests gasp because you don't make priests wait, you don't pause a wedding ceremony, you don't stop the sacred machinery once it's been set in motion, but I did. I held that microphone and I said, "Before I respond to what my groom just said, I need everyone here to know something." And my voice didn't shake the way I thought it would. It came out clear and strong, amplified through the church's sound system, so even the people standing in the back vestibule could hear every syllable, and I said, 6 months ago I received an anonymous letter at my office. Someone sent it in a plain envelope with no return address, and inside was a copy of a trust document, a real legal document notarized and filed, showing that my husband here has a daughter. She's 4 years old. Her name is Sophie, and he's been paying the mother $1,900 a month in unofficial support to keep her quiet. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacular. His mother actually screamed, a short, sharp sound like someone had stuck her with a pin. His father shot up from his seat. His sister's mouth fell open, and my husband's face drained of all color. His hand reached for me, but I stepped back, still holding that microphone, and I continued. The mother is Laura Chen. She worked at his father's company in the accounting department. She was 22 when they started their affair. He was 29. And supposedly in a committed relationship with someone else at the time. When she got pregnant, he offered her money to disappear. She took it because she was alone and scared and saw no other option, and he's been lying about this child's existence to everyone in his life for 4 years. And now people were standing, phones were coming out, his groomsmen were looking at each other with complete confusion, and the priest had actually backed all the way off the altar steps. I turned to his mother and said, "You have a granddaughter you've never met because your son is a coward who thought he could bury his mistakes with money," and she made this wounded animal noise, her hands grasping at her husband's arm, and I turned to his father and said, "You fired Laura Chen 2 months after she had the baby, marked her file as ineligible for rehire, and had your lawyers make her sign an NDA that's probably not even legal because it involves the cover-up of a child's existence." And he was shaking his head, but not with denial, with rage, the kind of rage that comes from being exposed, and I turned back to my husband and said, "You told me I was embarrassing, that I didn't belong in your world, but I know exactly what I am. I'm the daughter of your family's housekeeper. My mother cleaned your toilets for 20 years, and that's supposed to make me less than you. But at least I know where I come from. At least I don't have a secret child I pretend doesn't exist because acknowledging her would complicate my trust fund access." The church had erupted into chaos. Guests were talking over each other. His family was trying to leave, but my family had moved to block the side exits without anyone noticing, my cousins and uncles forming a human wall because my father had texted them the moment I held up my hand, and my husband finally found his voice and said, "How did you, when did you?" and I said into the microphone so everyone could still hear. I hired a private investigator the day after I got that letter. I spent $4,000 I didn't have. I met Laura and Sophie in a park in Philadelphia where they've been living in a one-bedroom apartment while you vacation in Santorini. Sophie has your eyes and your smile, and she thinks her father is dead because that's what you made Laura tell her. And I have 300 pages of documented evidence, including photos and financial records and text messages that prove every single thing I just said. His sister stood up and screamed, "This is a joke, right? You're not actually doing this at a wedding." And I looked at her and said, "You asked me last night if I understood my place. Well, this is me understanding it perfectly. This is me knowing exactly what I'm worth and what your family is worth. And spoiler alert, the math doesn't work out in your favor." And she sat back down like her legs had stopped working. And I turned to face all the guests, both sides of the church now, everyone I'd ever known and everyone my husband's family had invited to witness what was supposed to be my transformation into one of them, and I said, "I'm not marrying this man, obviously, but before everyone leaves I want you to know that Laura Chen is filing a petition to formally establish paternity. She's suing for proper child support based on his actual income, not the lowballed amount he's been paying her. And she's requesting a custody arrangement because Sophie deserves to know her father even if her father doesn't deserve her." My husband lunged for the microphone, but my father was faster. He'd been waiting for any excuse, and suddenly he was between us, not touching my husband, but standing in a way that made it clear any physical contact would be a mistake, and my mother was beside me, her arm around my waist, this woman who'd scrubbed other people's floors her entire life, standing in the church where she'd watched me play as a child when she brought me to work. And she whispered, "I'm so proud of you," so quietly that the microphone didn't catch it, but I felt it in my bones, and I handed the microphone to the priest, who took it with shaking hands and looked like he'd just witnessed something he'd need to confess himself. The next part happened fast. His father was shouting about lawsuits, about defamation, about family honor. His mother was crying these dramatic sobs that would have made me feel guilty any other day, but today just sounded like the noise of consequences finally arriving. His sister was on her phone, presumably calling lawyers or publicists or whoever rich people call when their carefully constructed facades collapse. And my husband just stood there at the altar looking at me like he couldn't understand how the narrative had flipped so completely, how the girl who was supposed to be grateful and compliant and eternally conscious of her lower station had just burned down his entire life in front of everyone who mattered to him. And I pulled off the engagement ring. This massive diamond his mother had insisted I wear, even though it had belonged to his grandmother, who'd apparently hated the idea of her precious grandson marrying the help's daughter, and I set it on the altar next to the unity candle that would never be lit. I walked down the aisle in my wedding dress, my mother on one side and my father on the other, my bridesmaids falling in behind us, my cousins and aunts and uncles. The priest actually blessed me as I passed, which felt simultaneously inappropriate and exactly right. And behind us the church was in complete meltdown. Guests were choosing sides physically, moving to different sections of pews. Some of his family's friends were leaving through the side doors, looking embarrassed to be associated with any of it, and I could hear his mother wailing, "How could you do this to us? How could you bring this shame on our family?" And I almost turned around to explain that I didn't do anything except tell the truth, that shame isn't something you can bring on someone else. It's something you create yourself through your actions and then try to hide, but I kept walking because I'd said everything I needed to say. The reception venue was at a hotel 3 blocks away. I'd paid for half of it with money I'd been saving since I was 16, and when we arrived the staff was confused about why the bride was there without the groom, without most of the guests. But my maid of honor, who'd been texting from the church, had already warned them something was happening. And I walked into that ballroom with its cream-colored linens and centerpieces I'd agonized over, and I said to the coordinator, "The wedding is canceled, but the party is not. Everyone here is invited to stay. Anyone who wants to leave can leave. Open all the bars, serve all the food. This is now a celebration of something else." And she looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but also like she understood completely. And within 15 minutes the music was playing. Not the carefully curated classical strings we'd planned, but the playlist my cousins had been begging me to use. And people were dancing, my people, the ones who'd known me before I ever met a man who thought his embarrassment was more important than my humanity. His family never came to the reception, obviously. They scattered from that church like roaches when the lights come on. But word spread fast the way it does in the age of smartphones and social media. By the time we were cutting into the cake that no groom was there to help with, #wedding exposure was trending locally. Someone's aunt had filmed part of my speech and posted it, and it was being shared thousands of times. News vans were showing up at the hotel asking for statements, and my phone was exploding with messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, some supportive, some horrified, some asking if I needed a lawyer because his family would definitely retaliate, and I turned my phone off and danced with my father, who cried for the first time in my memory and told me he should have stopped me from getting involved with that family in the first place, but he'd wanted me to be happy. Laura Chen called me 3 days later, her voice shaking with emotion that I couldn't quite identify as gratitude or anger or fear, and she said, "You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to blow up your life for me and Sophie." And I told her the truth, which was that I didn't do it for her. I did it for me. Because standing at that altar listening to the man I loved tell a church full of people that I embarrassed him had crystallized something I'd been trying to ignore for months, that he'd never actually loved me the way I loved him, that I'd been a rebellion for him, a way to piss off his family, a temporary deviation from his planned trajectory, and the moment it became real, the moment he had to actually integrate me into his world permanently, he couldn't do it. His conditioning was too strong. His need for approval from people who measured worth in property and pedigree was too powerful. And I deserved better than being someone's shameful secret compromise. The legal fallout was immediate and extensive. His family's lawyers sent me cease and desist letters demanding I retract my statements and claiming defamation, but my investigation had been thorough. Every claim I'd made was documented and provable, and when I filed a countersuit for the emotional distress of being defrauded into a relationship where my partner was hiding a child, their lawyers suddenly got very quiet. Laura's paternity suit moved forward, and DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew. My ex was ordered to pay actual child support calculated on his real income, which turned out to be substantially higher than what he'd been giving Laura, and the judge in that case made some pointed comments about men who thought they could buy their way out of responsibility. Sophie got a father who showed up inconsistently and uncomfortably, but at least existed in her life. And Laura used the increased support to move to a better apartment and go back to school, and sometimes she sends me pictures of Sophie, and I see this little girl who exists because her father couldn't keep his life compartmentalized, who became a secret, who was almost lost to shame, and I think about how many secrets get kept, how many children grow up wondering why they weren't enough to be acknowledged. My ex tried to reach out 6 months later, a long email that started with, "I've been in therapy," and included multiple paragraphs about his family trauma and his fear of disappointing his parents and his struggle with integrating different aspects of his identity, which I recognized as the kind of language people learn in expensive therapy that helps them reframe their cowardice as complexity. And he ended it by saying he still loved me and thought we could work through this if I could forgive him. And I read it 3 times trying to find any evidence that he understood what he'd actually done wrong, any acknowledgement that humiliating someone at your wedding isn't a symptom of family pressure, it's a choice, a deliberate cruelty performed for an audience. And when I couldn't find that acknowledgement, I deleted the email and blocked his address and decided that forgiveness was something I might achieve for my own peace, but not something I owed him as a gift. The video of my church speech ended up with over 2 million views across various platforms. Strangers debated it in comment sections, some calling me a hero, others saying I was vindictive and should have handled it privately, and I learned that women who refuse to absorb humiliation quietly are always going to be called vindictive by people who benefit from women absorbing humiliation quietly. Relationship podcasters analyzed my decision. Someone wrote an article calling it the most savage wedding revenge in modern history, which felt reductive but not entirely inaccurate, and through it all I kept working my job at the nonprofit where I'd been employed for 5 years, kept living in my apartment, kept existing in the life I'd built before I ever thought marrying into wealth would solve problems I didn't know I'd invented. His family's social standing took a hit, but not the kind you'd expect, not the permanent exile you'd hope for. Rich people forgive each other's transgressions with a fluidity that would seem miraculous if it wasn't so predictable. Within a year they were back at their galas and fundraisers, telling a modified version of events where I was a gold digger who tried to trap their son and then got vindictive when he saw through me. And some people believed it because people always believe the story told by money, but enough people knew the truth, had seen the video, had heard the details, and his mother could never quite meet eyes with the other society women the same way. There was always this flicker of knowledge that her family tree had a branch they'd tried to hide, that their moral superiority was performance art, and sometimes that's the only justice you get. Not the dramatic public collapse, but the slow erosion of certainty, the gradual understanding that everyone knows what you tried to conceal.